On Saturday, the Irish became a one-loss team. Tomorrow, they will look to avoid a second loss as they go on the road to a hostile environment against a team that's hoping to ruin their chances at a New Year's Six. We'll talk about that and more. Shamrock Sports starts now. To the second floor of the Duncan Student Center. I'm Pineda alongside Kelly Gorman and JJ Post. We'll break down that Cincinnati loss, plenty to talk about there, and we'll preview the game tomorrow in Blacksburg, which will be a tough test on the road for a Notre Dame team that's looking to not let this spiral past just this one loss against Cincinnati. So we'll start with just some initial reactions. Obviously, a loss that some expected. Notre Dame was not the favorite in this game against Cincinnati, but still not the way Notre Dame fans were hoping this game would go. Kelly, what are your initial reactions from the loss?
It was definitely a tough game to watch. I mean, I think early on we dug ourselves a hole with, I think, 3 turnovers in the first 18 minutes, and it was just really tough starting out for Notre Dame. And I think it's definitely something that's tough to watch in terms of the playoff situation. I mean, it's really rare that we're going to make the playoffs this year now, so.
Yeah, I mean, there's no easy way to put it. Notre Dame, played for the first time a true contender for the college football playoff, and, they didn't come up to the task. The fourth quarter fight back was nice to see. You got a couple touchdowns in the end that, put it within striking distance, but at the end, close only gets you a win in horseshoes and hand grenades. And, I think if you're the Irish, there's a lot of things to look back and say, if we played our cards right, if we made the right calls, we would have won that game, because you're never going to be an elite team if you spend the first half beating yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is a game that you look at, and part of that was Notre Dame's mistakes costing them the game, and part of that was the Cincinnati team came in definitely ready to compete in that matchup, and credit to them is definitely deserved, but also it's hard to look past a lot of those mistakes this Notre Dame team made. But I will say, when you look so far this season, it did feel like that loss was inevitable. This never felt like a team that could potentially have this undefeated regular season realistically. And at least when you look at it, the silver lining, I think, is Cincinnati was the best team on this schedule. It was the game that did have a lot of mistakes in it, and like you said, could have been played differently. But it's not really the same thing as dropping a random game to an unranked team. At least if there was going to be a loss, it was a loss that did feel like it was deserved by the opposing team. But Notre Dame, like we talked about, there were struggles in a lot of facets. One of those was also the rushing game, 84 rushing yards, and just not able to capitalize on any mistakes by the Cincinnati team either. So when you look forward, now a one-loss team, how does this loss change the season outlook? JJ, we'll start with you.
Well, not to play spin doctor already, but technically you're not eliminated from the playoffs yet. It's college football. It is a sport that has long it had the calling card of anarchy, chaos, and dumber things have happened than a one-loss team making the playoffs, especially if, Cincinnati wins out. There are worse resumes to have than having your only loss being to presumably the number 3 seed. That being said, it changes things quite a bit. Realistically speaking, Notre Dame's probably not going to make the playoff as a one-loss 4 seed. It would take some chaos of, magnanimous proportions to, even get them in that conversation. That being said, the New Year's Six Bowl is not a bad thing to play for. It's a prestigious game in any other season, especially for Notre Dame, when I think coming in, the realistic perception of this season was it's going to be a rebuilding year. And I think if you offered anyone, any Notre Dame fan, a New Year's Six Bowl at the beginning of the season, an 11-1 season, I think they would have taken it. So I think there's a bit of perception. It obviously sucks to lose a game and no longer be in that playoff conversation, especially when there's that feeling that if you won this, you could have pretty easily won out. But I think you got to go back to the beginning of the season. You offer me an 11-1, I would have taken that.
Kelly, your thoughts?
Most definitely, but I have to disagree with you there, JJ. I think every season we go into the season thinking we want a championship, and I think we ruined our chances at that by losing to Cincinnati. Of course, I would never oppose an 11-1 season with a New Year's Six, but honestly, I'm just devastated. I think it's another year where we're not going to get a chance at the championship, and I think that's another sad year of Notre Dame football, but I think if we're looking at the upside, 11-1 and New Year's Six would be amazing. So.
Yeah, definitely a lot of valuable points there, and I think you made that point, JJ, of if you had told us at the beginning of the season, said Notre Dame could go 11-1, make a New Year's Six, what Notre Dame fan wouldn't really have taken that? This just didn't really ever feel like a team where you would kind of turn your nose up at that, because it just always felt like it was kind of that rebuilding year, and if not a rebuilding year, then just a year where a lot of different stuff was coming into play, and there were so many unknowns that it would have been really hard to kind of bank on anything more than that or to have expectations like higher than that. That being said, it still is a disappointment and it doesn't really make the loss feel any easier. But I think when you return to those initial expectations, you're right that a lot of people would have taken that. So that brings us to the big question of the week, which is now what do you do at quarterback? Because Drew Pyne's performance in that game was obviously the spark that it looked like Notre Dame needed. The only time it really felt like Notre Dame could have won that game was when Drew Pyne was in at quarterback. So what does that mean for the future of this quarterback situation, JJ?
Listen, I'll put my hands in the air here. I, at the start of the season, was a card-carrying. Jack Cohn is a fine quarterback, guy. I was telling it to anyone that would listen that Jack Cohn is, while not exactly Ian Book, while not exactly, a game breaker, he was a fine quarterback. He could lead us to, a 12-0 season. That being said, it's time to ride the pine. Drew Pyne has shown in his 2 appearances, both in relief, that he is a better option than Jack Cohn simply because, he offers another dimension. He is a bit more mobile, and especially in a season where you've lost Blake Fisher, at least for now you don't have Blake Fisher, and the line's constantly collapsing. Drew Pyne, like we're seeing in those highlights, he can both throw the ball deep like Cohn can. That's Cohn's, benefit. He can hit the ball accurately and deep. But he also offers that second dimension of being able to escape the pocket when it's collapsing. That I think Jack Cohn just can't give you, when the blitz comes, when the opposing teams bring pressure. Jack Cohn's not getting out of that pocket. And Drew Pyne, even if it's a little chance, he gives you that little chance to succeed on a broken play. And I think that's what gives him the difference, what makes it the reason why Brian Kelly, if he wants to, at minimum, play for, win every game now on, his better option is Drew Pyne.
Kelly, do you agree with that?
I 100% agree. I have to agree with you, JJ. I think originally I was on the Cohn train and I was like, Cohn all the way. But the past 2 weeks, Pyne has sparked the offense when we needed it. Besides his staple fashion piece of the flat cap, which not a lot of people know about, as you can see here, which I love. I think Ian Book had a similar start. I think if Drew Pyne takes advantage of this opportunity that he is going to get, I think that's the way to go.
Yeah, Brian Kelly talked about that idea that just like Pyne didn't transfer when Pyne could have transferred. Like he knew that there was a transfer quarterback coming in and Drew Pyne kept his name with Notre Dame. He did not go to the transfer portal and that was rewarded. Then he had a chance and he took advantage of it when that chance came. Pyne was really that spark in the game that Notre Dame did need. And Brian Kelly this week has stressed the importance of experience going into Virginia Tech, and granted, like that would be a really tough game for Drew Pyne to get his first start in, on the road in Blacksburg, which is notoriously one of the toughest road environments. But I do think that would be a conversation that obviously probably was had in some capacity this week, whatever quarterback they end up going with, because of that spark that Pyne provided that was so sorely needed against Cincinnati. But with the quarterbacks aside, obviously that's kind of the biggest question. What is the other biggest change that you think needs to be made? Putting that one aside, Kelly.
I think Tommy Rees needs to draw up plays that make up for the O-line's deficiencies. I think we need to stick with the quick passes, the screen passes, and then we still have to figure out the run game. I feel like we've been talking about this for weeks on end, but I think this run game still needs some improvement, and we need to look for better play calling there.
JJ?
Certainly, and for me, it's the defense, especially in the second level of defense, because Cincinnati, what really changed that game, the final drive, Cincinnati got the ball back, and we're going to see now in the first quarter, actually, or the second quarter, rather, Cincinnati is continually, and other teams Notre Dame has played, continually hitting Notre Dame for big plays in times when Notre Dame needs it the least. The secondary hasn't been bad, but especially the linebackers, J.D. Bertrand in particular, a couple really uncharacteristic plays where he just got beat over the middle, and, for that final drive for Cincinnati, that was the backbreaker, the play that, we felt like you had them pinned against the wall. You can make the stop here, get the ball, get a touchdown, win this game. Cincinnati just hit them right over the middle and got a 30, 40-yard game, and I think that's the type of play that Notre Dame can't allow if they want to be a serious contender anytime else this season.
Yeah, the kind of play that Notre Dame can't have on the other side of the ball is some of those drops, like the Kevin Austin drop, obviously would be the most blatant example to point to of just that kind of moment where it quite literally felt like it was slipping through your fingertips in terms of just watching that opportunity go away. And obviously that would have been a huge momentum changer, a huge game changer if Kevin Austin hadn't had that drop. But it's not the first one. Lindsey had one, and a big one, and Michael Mayer has had a few too. So it's kind of been all throughout those targets. We've seen some of those drops this season. And obviously that's not really a novel concept to eliminate the drops. I'm sure that's kind of an area of focus and a pretty easy one to point to. But that being said, it's a really important one. I think just one of those really easy things to check off the list in terms of that's just a pretty simple fix, but one that can't keep happening if you want to be able to kind of take that momentum and run with it instead of having some of those big momentum changes toward your opponent. So that being said, that's kind of our main Cincinnati takeaways. I think we we covered some of those main things, some of our main points that really give pause when you look toward the rest of the season. But there's also plenty of other sports happening around campus right now, and we have Jake Irons to tell us all about them.
Welcome back to the Fall Sports Recap. I'm Jacob Irons. We'll take a look at the women's volleyball team and the men's tennis team. First, we'll start with the women's volleyball team as they open their road trip on a high as they top the number 18 ranked Georgia Tech Yellow Jackets in a come-from-behind victory. Sophomore Aubrey Hamilton matched her career high with 20 kills. Her kills came with a .375 hitting percentage. Hamilton broke a 2-2 tie in the fifth set that allowed the Notre Dame Fighting Irish to go on a 6-1 run later in the set. The Lady Fighting Irish kept their winning spirits alive as they topped Clemson in a clean sweep of sets. Notre Dame racked up 9 service aces, providing a spark the team has been missing. Prior to this weekend, Notre Dame was on a 5-game losing streak and was a team missing an identity. However, it looks like they have found it. The volleyball team returns to action today as they take on Syracuse at 7 o'clock in Purcell Pavilion. And now flipping gears to men's tennis, where the duo of Shea and Vashista won the Michigan State Invitational. The Irish twosome won the mini-duel event after defeating teams from Marquette, Louisville, Illinois, and Indiana. Shea and Vashista went 4-0 on the weekend. They are back in action all this week as they travel to Tulsa, Oklahoma to take part in the ITA All-American Championships. That's going to do it for this Fall Sports Recap. For Shamrock Sports, I'm Jacob Irons.
Thank you, Jake. As we mentioned before, we're going to get into this Virginia Tech preview, but first we're going to take a look around the rest of college football and do what still feels like a way too early college football playoff projection, but becoming less way too early and a little bit more to the time when maybe these predictions make a little bit more sense. Still at the top, it seems like the consensus would stay Bama and Georgia kind of leading the pack, but we have our way too early college football playoff projections. JJ, we'll start with you if you want to give your 4.
Well, you said it. Alabama and Georgia kind of right now, the two names that you can Sharpie in there. Both teams look totally dominant in the SEC. Both teams seem to be on a collision course for the SEC championship game. Cincinnati, I'm going to throw in there as my third team. They beat Notre Dame, so obviously a bit of recency bias, perhaps wanting our win to look a little better. But realistically, if you look at Cincinnati's schedule, there's not a lot of games where you really see them losing. They've hit their 2 biggest tests against Indiana and Notre Dame, respectively. They win those 2 games. I don't really see them winning losing any others the rest of the season. And then for my 4th team, I'm going to take Iowa. They got a big game coming up this weekend against Penn State, but it's in Kinnick Stadium, and I think Iowa, riding the home momentum, is going to get a big win there. You're seeing the defense right here. They have 12 interceptions. That's the most in the NCAA. All of the college football. Iowa's defense, quite simply, is making life hell for quarterbacks. They are picking anyone off. They're bringing the pressure. And I think this is, the Iowa team that Kirk Ferentz has been building for years and years. He's been there, I believe, the longest tenured coach in Power 5. And this is like the magnum opus of his teams. They're stingy on defense. They're serviceable on offense. I think they're going to beat Penn State at home. And I think they're going to beat Ohio State in the Big Ten Championship and finally give us, a new playoff team.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think Bama and Georgia are definitely Sharpied in. No question about that. Cincinnati, definitely the rest of their schedule is not looking too tough. And I think my 4th, I'm going to go with Ohio State. They lost to a good Oregon team in week 2, but I think they're really just starting to hit their stride. They have a tough schedule coming up, but I think if they can get through the 2 Michigans, then they really have a chance at playoffs.
Yeah, we have a bit of a theme coming here because I'm going to take also Cincinnati. I think they'll be in, which statistically is not super likely to happen right now still, even like with all those projections. But you would expect Cincinnati, like you said, to probably win out after facing the 2 of their toughest tests and coming out of them both with a win. And then Penn State is the last one I'll take. So obviously that Iowa matchup this weekend will prove one of us more correct than the other. But Penn State's defense this year has been allowing just 12 points per game, really a dominant performance from the defense. If that offense can match it, I think this Penn State team has a chance to stay in those playoff talks as the season continues. So we've talked about Penn State, we've talked about some of these other outside teams who might have a chance to come in, but let's go back to Bama and Georgia, who we've Sharpied in. And I think the question right now kind of might even be as extreme as Bama versus everyone. So when we look at those two, I would take Bama just with Bryce Young and the way that he's been playing the Heisman favorite for a very good reason. Bama really looks like this really dominant team, which doesn't really come as a surprise to everyone. But after seeing Clemson take a bit of a drop off this year, Alabama sitting alone at the top of the standings right now, and Clemson kind of falling off that kind of perennial number 2 for the last few years. So I would take Bama versus everyone. Kelly, what do you think?
I got to go with Bama. I think they're just as dominant as they seem. And I think if it's them versus Georgia, then Georgia's offense is going to mess up in the championship game. I don't think they can match Bama's defense, so that'll be interesting. But I definitely Bama.
All right, you fairly framed this as Bama versus everyone. I'll take the field. More specifically, I'll take Georgia. 2021's been a wild year for college football. Why not have Georgia win a national championship? Break the streak, break the curse. This is Georgia's best team in years, I think. Whether it's going to be good enough to beat Alabama, we'll find out soon enough. Obviously we'll get that SEC title game. But I think this is the Georgia team that if you were to make a Georgia team that is good enough to beat Alabama, this is the one. It's not going to light you up on offense. That's not an electric. Georgia's never really been an electric offensive team. That being said, this defense is every bit as good as Alabama's, and it's every bit as good as any defense in the country. So I think this Georgia team, if they can force Alabama into a 21-20 kind of game, if they can force Alabama to a low-scoring slugfest, keep the ball on the ground, keep the ball out of Bryce Young's hands, I think Georgia can win this national title. I think crazier things happen in college football, and obviously picking Georgia to win a national title is a bit like picking against yourself. But I think this is the year. I'm going Georgia.
Fair enough. That's a very convincing argument there. But yes, it does seem like at this point Alabama and Georgia are the two that it really does make sense to have that conversation about. And we'll see. Maybe that Georgia prediction will end up coming true down the stretch as we watch. I'm very curious to see how this Georgia team continues to fare in the rest of the schedule that they have ahead of them. So we'll turn back now to Notre Dame football after talking about other sports on campus, thanks to Jacob, and after talking about the rest of the college football playoff. But when you look at Saturday's matchup, there's obviously a lot of factors that go into this, a lot of question marks after that Cincinnati game. But JJ, we'll start with you. What do you think is going to be the biggest factor, the single biggest factor on Saturday?
It's a road game in Blacksburg night. You got to go with the crowd. Lane Stadium notoriously is an electric atmosphere to play in. When Enter Sandman comes on to start that game, the place is going to be going berserk. And if you got Drew Pine starting, we don't know who's going to start quarterback, but if it is indeed Drew Pine, that's one hell of a hard environment for your rookie quarterback to make his first start in. I think Virginia Tech, their program right now, they're in a place where they need to build some momentum. They're feeling, confidence. They beat UNC at home already. They took a loss to, West Virginia, but now they got a little bit of top 25 buzz of their own. So I think if you're Virginia Tech, you're pretty amped up for this game, and you want to bring the energy. Every college football team wants to beat Notre Dame. That's the fact of the matter. And I think if you're Virginia Tech, if you're a Virginia Tech student, you're going to be at this game, and you're going to be yelling your lungs out. So I think the crowd's going to be the biggest factor to that play.
Yeah, Kelly?
Yeah, I definitely thought the crowd at first too, but then I thought more about it, and I'm thinking coming back after our first home loss. I think Notre Dame's team is not going to feel as much pressure as they ever felt before, especially with Pine at quarterback. I think they're going to think there's a guy at quarterback who's never started before. It's kind of not as serious as it once was, and so if the Notre Dame comes in not feeling as much pressure as usual, then this might be a tough game for them.
Yeah, and that's assuming Pine starts at quarterback, which officially Cohn is still listed on the depth chart as the starter, and Kelly has pointed to that all week. But it will be interesting to see if there is still a possibility, I guess, that was a tactic like being employed, maybe like something that Kelly wanted to kind of allude to all week, and maybe that's not actually the case. But Kelly all week has said, we want to go with experience, and on that depth chart that was released, Cohn is still the top. That being said, Pine has also been in that number 2 spot on the depth chart pretty solidly, even on those weeks that Buckner played when Pine didn't. So a little bit of leeway there and a little bit of subjectivity, but on the official depth chart, Cohn's still the starter. But I think the biggest factor on Saturday comes back to, similar to the point you made about the crowd, is the O-line, which this O-line has had a lot of struggles this year that have been well documented and seen, well discussed. But I think this O-line, now you go into Blacksburg, and last time Notre Dame played in Blacksburg, they were whistled for a false start penalty on just the second offensive snap of the game. So if that's something that is going to continue and be a trend on Saturday, that can prove really costly, especially with an O-line that's already really experienced and already really laboring through the first 5 games of the season. So to me, that's where the eye goes. And Kelly has said this week too, the O-line gets all the scrutiny, and he said this isn't a situation of let's throw them under the bus. He said this is on all of us. And while it really is, those false start penalties, should those start to pop up on Saturday, that's pretty pinpointed to the O-line. So some of the other struggles are a lot more widespread on the offense, but should those happen, would be a pretty big mistake for that O-line. But that's going to bring us to our next Notre Dame players to watch. So JJ, we'll start with you. We're going to pick one offensive, one defense. Who are you watching on this Notre Dame team on Saturday?
On offense, I'll go to Michael Meyer, because Meyer, actually, in my opinion, is kind of the answer to both quarterback questions. Like we said, we don't know if it's going to be Jack Cohn or Drew Pine on Saturday. The indication has been it's Jack Cohn. But either way, Meyer's going to be a pretty big factor. He has been both quarterbacks kind of safety valve. For Drew Pine, if he's scrambling out of the pocket like he likes to do, Meyer's always there in that little crossing route, maybe that little flat route to hit him with. And Jack Cohn, when he's trying to get rid of the ball in the pocket, the same applies. If he needs to look for a short, quick option, Michael Myers that guy. And that's not even talking about the touchdown contributions he's had. He's a nightmare matchup for opposing defenses. It's very hard to put a guy on someone who can run, someone who's got as big a body as Meyer, and I think he's going to be a pretty big factor, just in the Notre Dame passing attack, no matter who's passing. On defense, I'm going to go Isaiah Foskey. Foskey sparked that mini comeback against Cincinnati with his strip sack, and really, I think it's fair to say he has been Notre Dame's most dominant, pure pass rusher all season. He's been in opposing backfields all season. I think if Notre Dame wants to swing the momentum like they did against Cincinnati, against the hostile Road Environment in Virginia Tech, Foskey's going to be the guy that's going to need to be in the backfield, making Braxton Burmeister's life hell.
Kelly?
I think even though we're not sure who's going to start out, I'm going to go Pine. I think last time I was here, I said my offensive player to watch was Cone, and I think the tables have turned. I think early on, Cone started out really well, and then it kind of, in the past few games, not so well. And I think for Pine, it's a similar situation. He started out really well, sparking the offense, and now we have to see if he can maintain that. For defense, I'm going to go Cam Hart. He didn't start the season out as well as we would have hoped, but in the game against Wisconsin, he had 2 interceptions. And then in the game against Cincinnati, we didn't hear his name once. But I think that's important because as a cornerback, you don't want your name to be heard. So I think that means that we need to watch him this Saturday and see what he can do.
Yeah, absolutely. On offense, I'm going to go with Kyron Williams. I think so far we've alluded to it already, but the run game has really struggled, and that's a run game where Williams and Chris Tyree last year were these breakout players, had breakout seasons. So far this year, we haven't seen that, and Kyron Williams is a very enthusiastic player. He really likes to talk about the high expectations he sets for himself, and so far it's been a little bit of a disappointment there, and obviously we returned to the O-line, and that is a disappointing part of that, to see this O-line not offer him the protection that obviously he would need to succeed and have some of these breakaway runs that he had last year. But according to, there's this website called CFB Graphs, which does this expected points added per rush statistic that's being used more throughout college football now. But according to them, Notre Dame's EPA per rush is negative .217 through 5 games. So that means that for every snap, every time you rush, that's how much the expected points decreases by on that drive. So obviously not a good metric. The good news, though, is that Virginia Tech's is about the opposite, on the other side. So Virginia Tech's defense has been allowing that many, an increase in points that much. This is hard to explain, but you see the gist. You see where I'm going with this. Basically, if there's a matchup that's going to favor Notre Dame between Wisconsin, Cincinnati, and this one, it's an overwhelmingly better matchup against Virginia Tech, and that's only going to continue to get easier in opponents after that. So maybe there's a little bit more positivity coming here for this run game, maybe a little bit of a chance to make up for a bit of a slow start to the season. On the other side of the ball, I'm going Kyle Hamilton. It's kind of the easy pick here, but Hamilton obviously really showing, again, so far this season, why he's that All-American, why he's the name that's talked about so frequently, and I see no reason to see why that shouldn't continue this weekend in Blacksburg and beyond. So now we've talked about some of those specific players. On a scale from 1 to 10, we'll start with you, Kelly. How crucial is this game to the rest of the season? Obviously, this depends how you define a successful season, but we've already kind of set out our expectations for that in talking about that 11-1 New Year's 6 kind of idea. But just speaking more broadly, on a scale from 1 to 10, how crucial is this game?
I think it's really crucial. I would give it a 9.8. I think how we defined our season of success is 11-1 season, New Year's 6, and I think in order to get that, we have to win this game. So I would say 9.8.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of do this in 2 parts. I'd say the game itself is a 7.5. Virginia Tech in themselves are probably not the hardest team we'll play for the rest of the schedule, but I think, like you touched on earlier in this show, the response is what really matters to Notre Dame here. And I think, if you're talking level of importance and, on the more psychological perspective, how Notre Dame responds to a loss for the first time in a while, I think that makes it, a really 9-10 level game.
So as a follow-up to that then, what do you think are the chances, we don't need to get super specific, but just higher level, what are the chances this Notre Dame team can win out the rest of its games on the schedule? JJ?
I think it's doable. I mean, Virginia Tech, USC, UNC is by no means an easy stretch. They're not. None of those teams are probably college football playoff teams. None of them, hell, are probably even top 10 teams. But they're all good teams in their own right, and they're all teams that are going to give you trouble, especially Virginia Tech at home. USC is a talented team, and if they get the right coach, which I'm assuming they're going to make in the next few weeks, they're going to put the talent together eventually. UNC, they're not been the best this season. They've underperformed a bit, but Sam Howell is still looking forward to the draft. One of the best quarterbacks in the country. So I think those 3 games, if you win out those games, then you move on to the next ones. But I think it's take every game by itself, take every game one by one, and see how you do, because I think you can survive the rest of the schedule.
Kelly,
I think, yeah, same thing. I think I think it's super doable. I think Virginia Tech, it won't be super easy, but I think we can get it done. I think USC, UNC, Navy at home, home field advantage. I think we'll really take advantage of that, and I think Notre Dame will be able to do it.
Yeah, it's definitely something that will be interesting to see as we've looked at like how some of these opponents have really had a drop off from their initial like preseason rankings. So many of these teams had much higher expectations. Notre Dame's strength of schedule since then has really taken a dive. I mean, you talked about USC, which coming into the season was expected to be a pretty mediocre team, and so far have had a pretty disastrous start to the season that included firing their head coach just a couple games in. So many of these teams that Notre Dame kind of circled, UNC being another one of those, have really not met the expectations for the quality of opponent that Notre Dame expected them to be. That being said, it does make it easier when you look at the rest of the season in terms of looking at Notre Dame's ability to win out. But obviously that starts with Virginia Tech on Saturday, and should they not be able to do that, the rest of the season is a little bit more called into question, and the question then arises, is this the beginning of a spiral and a trend that definitely Notre Dame fans would not want to see this team taking? But that brings us to our score predictions and the question of whether or not we think that will happen this weekend. So first, we're going to point out that Chris was the only one last week who did predict the Cincinnati win. So we did feel like we had to call attention to that. Thank you, Chris. Well, not really thank you, Chris. I mean, we hoped that Chris would not be the one who was correct, but he was. So congrats to Chris on his correct pick. But this week, what are our thoughts, starting with JJ?
Yeah, I was pretty openly bullish about the Cincinnati point. I'd like to point out that I dapped up Chris immediately after the show because I agreed with that prediction. But that being said, I'm not listen, I'm worried about this Notre Dame team in the same way everyone else is. You know, they have to respond from a loss. You know, there are some question marks to the offensive line. But I think this Notre Dame team is going to be fired up. I think they're going to want to come back strong. And I'm going to take a 30-24 Irish win.
I'm going to take something similar. I'm going to say 27-21 Irish win. I think we're going to go out there, and I think we're definitely going to recognize that we have to go out there and prove what kind of team we are, and I think Notre Dame will do a good job at that. I think it's absurd that we were even considered underdogs for a minute there, but I think the Irish can definitely do this one.
Yeah, definitely a tough road test, and definitely not too bad of a team to go against, but I do think the biggest factor there will be that crowd environment. I think Notre Dame's going to get off to a little bit of a slow start in that tough environment to play in on the road, but I do think that they will be able to recover from that, and I think Notre Dame will win 27-17. So we'll do quick final thoughts, starting with you, Kelly. Just any final thoughts you have about tomorrow's matchup with the Hokies?
I'm really excited for it. I think Notre Dame really has to come out there strong. And like you said, it might be a slow start, but we can't let that get the best of us. I mean, we started out Cincinnati rough, and it ended just as rough. I think we have to be able to come back in the second half if that's what's necessary. And I think Notre Dame really can bring the heat.
I know you said final thoughts for Virginia Tech. I'm going to go more general point. Can I just say how excited I am to be on Team Chaos the rest of the year? Every Notre Dame student, this is an opportunity. Root for upsets, root for the top 10 to go down. We want to have 4 one-loss, 2-loss teams at the end of the year. We want to be the least fraudulent of all the frauds. Go Irish, go Chaos.
What a great assessment. I love that. I love the energy behind that. Such a great sentiment to give out to the Notre Dame student body and fan base here. Yeah, kind of similarly, I'm excited to see what happens in Blacksburg, excited to see how this Notre Dame team rebounds after the loss to Cincinnati. So from all of us here at Shamrock Sports, thank you to our producers and directors and everyone behind the scenes, and to Jake, our cameraman. This has been Shamrock Sports.